The alarm on the training deck cut through the air before I even finished my sentence, and for a moment, I thought the humans had triggered it by accident, because that is the kind of mistake I expected from them. I was wrong. It was not an accident. It was a warning, though I did not understand that yet. I was too busy laughing. My name is Vren Kadar, and I have served the Kaelvorn fleet since I was old enough to hold a blade without cutting my own hand off. My people have fought for 10,000 years. We do not remember a time before war, because there was no such time. War made us. It shaped our bones, hardened our skin, sharpened our instincts, until fighting became as natural to us as breathing. When the Galactic Concord accepted humanity as a provisional member species, I laughed harder than I had laughed in years. Everyone on my ship laughed with me. I remember standing on the observation deck, looking down at the small human transport docking beside our cruiser, and feeling nothing but contempt. They were soft, their skin bruised at the lightest touch. They had no claws, no venom, no natural armor, no enhanced senses. Their scientists called them adaptable. I called them lucky, nothing more. A species that had somehow avoided being wiped out by something stronger before they managed to crawl into space. I was assigned to oversee a joint exercise between our forces and theirs, a routine evaluation meant to test compatibility for future operations. My superior, High Commander Doruk Vale, gave me the assignment with a smirk on his scaled face. "Show them what real strength looks like," he told me. "Do not embarrass the fleet by going easy on them." I promised him I wouldn't. The human detachment arrived that morning, 4 soldiers, led by a young officer named Captain Owen Locke. I met them at the docking bay with my arms crossed and my chest puffed out, the way my kind does when we want to remind lesser beings of their place. Locke was polite, professional, calm, in a way that almost annoyed me. I wanted them nervous. I wanted them afraid. Instead, they walked onto our ship like they belonged there, like they had nothing to prove. 3 of them barely registered in my memory afterward. Daniel Ashford, tall and quiet, watched everything with sharp eyes but said very little. Grace Whitfield moved with the calm efficiency of someone used to following orders without complaint. And then there was the 4th soldier, a woman who stood slightly apart from the rest, her expression unreadable, her presence somehow heavier than her small frame should have allowed. Her name was Elena Voss. I did not think much of her at first. She was shorter than the others, her hair pulled back tightly, her uniform simple and unadorned except for a strange metal case strapped across her back. I assumed it was decorative, some human custom I did not understand or care to learn. I remember thinking she looked tired, the way a person looks after carrying something heavy for a very long time. During the introductions, I made no effort to hide my amusement. I told Captain Locke, quite bluntly, that I found it curious the Concord had allowed such a fragile species to join at all. I told him humans reminded me of insects, numerous and persistent, but ultimately harmless. I expected him to bristle, to defend his people the way lesser officers often did when insulted. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he had heard the insult 1,000 times before, and found it boring. It was Elena who caught my attention, not because she reacted, but because she did not. She stood there, silent, her eyes fixed on me with something that was not anger and was not fear. It looked almost like patience. I did not understand it then. I dismissed it as human weakness, an inability to properly respond to a challenge. The training exercise began later that day, in the ship's main combat simulation chamber, a room built to withstand blows that could shatter steel. My soldiers went first, sparring against each other to demonstrate our natural strength and speed. The humans watched from the observation platform, arms crossed, expressions neutral. I performed well, as I always did, defeating 2 of my own soldiers within minutes, my claws leaving shallow marks along the padded walls. When it was the humans' turn, I expected clumsy movements, slow reactions, embarrassing failures that would give my crew something to laugh about for weeks. Ashford and Whitfield performed adequately, better than I expected but nothing remarkable, using coordinated tactics and defensive formations that showed discipline if not raw power. I gave them polite, condescending praise, the kind you give a child who has done something mildly impressive for their age. Then it was Elena's turn. She stepped onto the mat without ceremony, without the tense energy the others carried. She moved like someone walking into a room she had entered 1,000 times before. Her opponent was one of my strongest soldiers, A careworn warrior twice her size, his claws extended, his confidence radiating off him like heat. The match lasted 11 seconds. I did not understand what I saw. She moved without wasted motion, without hesitation, redirecting his strength against him with an economy of movement I had never witnessed from a human before. My soldier hit the mat hard, more from surprise than force, and the room went silent. I remember the way she helped him up afterward, extending a hand, saying something quiet that made him laugh despite himself. I told myself it was luck. I told myself she had simply caught him off guard, that any of my warriors could correct the mistake in a rematch. I was not ready to admit what I had actually seen, because admitting it meant questioning everything I believed about strength, about power, about what made a species worthy of respect. That night, in the officers' mess, I brought it up anyway, unable to let it go. I told my crew it was a fluke, an accident of timing, nothing more. I said humans had no true warrior tradition, no history of real conflict, nothing to draw from except modern training programs designed by soft-handed scientists in comfortable laboratories. I said their so-called soldiers were playing dress-up in uniforms, pretending to be something they were not. I did not know Elena was standing in the doorway until I heard her voice. I am not sure how long she had been listening, but she did not look angry. She looked almost amused, the same tired patience from before settling over her features like a second skin. She walked further into the room, and the conversation around the table died out as my crew noticed her. "You should be careful making assumptions about things you don't understand," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. I laughed at her. Of course I did. I told her that I understood plenty, that I had studied human history in preparation for this assignment, that I knew about your wars and your treaties, and your endless political squabbles, and that none of it amounted to anything close to what my people had endured for 10,000 years. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she simply said that history was not something you could fully understand from records and reports, and that some things could only be understood by standing across from them. I should have paid more attention to the way she said that. Instead, I focused on the case strapped across her back, the one she carried everywhere, even to meals, even to briefings. I asked her what it was, expecting some mundane answer about tradition or sentiment. "It's a blade," she said simply. I laughed again, louder this time, and my crew laughed with me. A blade, an actual bladed weapon, carried by a soldier in an age of energy weapons and long-range strikes, in a fleet equipped with technology far beyond anything her ancestors could have imagined a century ago. I told her it was the most ridiculous thing I had seen since arriving on this assignment. A toy, carried by someone too nostalgic to embrace real weapons. She did not argue with me. She simply smiled, that same small, tired smile, and told me that some things were passed down not because they were practical, but because they meant something too important to leave behind. I did not understand what she meant. I did not want to understand it. I was too consumed by my own certainty, too comfortable in my contempt, to notice the warning in her words. The next morning, Commander Vale informed me that the Concord observers wanted a final demonstration before certifying the joint exercise complete, something more decisive than the earlier sparring matches, a clear test of individual combat capability between representatives of both species. He looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because it mirrored my own ambition. "You should volunteer," he said. "Show them exactly what I sent you there to show them." I did not need to be told twice. I walked straight to the human quarters and requested a formal match, my voice dripping with false politeness as I addressed Captain Locke. I told him I wanted to test their strongest soldier, to settle the question of capability once and for all, so that no one aboard this ship would ever again question the natural order between our species. Locke did not answer immediately. He glanced past me, toward the narrow corridor where Elena stood, arms crossed, watching the exchange with that same unreadable expression she always seemed to wear. She stepped forward before he could speak. "I'll do it," she said. I smiled, because this was exactly what I wanted. I told her I was pleased she had volunteered herself, that it would save everyone the trouble of choosing, and that I looked forward to demonstrating something she would remember for the rest of her short human life. She did not react to the insult. She simply nodded once, turned, and walked back toward her quarters, presumably to prepare. I watched her go, feeling nothing but satisfaction, utterly convinced that within a day, I would have proof of everything I already believed. I did not notice the way the other humans looked at each other after she left the room. I did not notice the quiet exchange between Ashford and Whitfield, a look that carried some private understanding I was not part of. I did not notice, because I was not looking for warnings. I was only looking for confirmation. That evening, I trained harder than I had in months, running through combat drills with my crew, sharpening my claws, reviewing every advantage my biology gave me over theirs. I told myself this was simply thorough preparation, the discipline my people were known for, but in truth, I think some small part of me sensed that something about Elena Voss did not fit the pattern I had built in my mind. I ignored that feeling. I always ignored feelings that contradicted what I wanted to believe. I slept poorly that night, though I would not admit it to anyone. I told myself it was excitement, anticipation for the demonstration to come, the certainty of victory keeping my mind restless. Looking back now, I understand it was something else entirely, some instinct buried deep beneath layers of pride, trying to warn me about the day that was coming. The morning of the match arrived clear and quiet, the kind of stillness that exists right before something irreversible happens. I walked toward the combat chamber with my head high, my crew gathered behind me, murmuring their confidence in my victory. The human soldiers arrived shortly after, calm, composed, none of them betraying the slightest hint of concern for their comrade. I did not understand their calm. I mistook it for ignorance, for a failure to grasp the seriousness of what was about to happen. I did not consider, even for a moment, that their calm came from something else entirely, from knowledge I did not yet possess, from having seen this exact scene play out before in ways I could not imagine. Elena entered last, the metal case still strapped across her back, her expression as unreadable as it had been since the moment I first saw her. She walked to the center of the mat and stood there, waiting, patient, still. I stepped forward, my claws extended, my confidence absolute, utterly unaware that everything I believed about strength and weakness was about to be tested in a way I had never experienced before. I made one final comment before the match began, unable to resist the urge to remind everyone in the room exactly why this outcome was inevitable. I told her that toys were meant to be put away, not carried into battle. She reached back, unclipped the case from her shoulders, and set it on the ground beside her feet. Then she looked at me, and for the first time since we had met, something shifted behind her eyes, something quiet and certain and utterly without doubt. "You should have listened," she said, "when I told you that some things can only be understood by standing across from them." I did not understand what she meant. Not yet. I stood there for a moment, staring at the case she had set on the ground, waiting for her to open it, waiting for the ridiculous ceremony to begin. Instead, she rolled her shoulders once, exhaled slowly, and settled into a stance so simple it looked almost careless. No claws, no armor plating, no weapon in her hands at all. Just a woman, standing calmly in the center of a combat mat, facing a warrior of a species that had never lost a single recorded duel against an unarmed opponent. I remember feeling almost insulted. I had expected her to draw the blade immediately, to give me something worth defeating. Instead, she stood there empty-handed, as if the weapon strapped to her back had been nothing more than decoration after all, exactly as I had originally assumed. I decided I would finish this quickly, without cruelty, simply to prove a point and move on with my day. The referee, a neutral Concord observer stationed on our vessel, called the start of the match. I moved first, the way I always did, closing the distance between us in less than a second, my claws extended toward her shoulder in a strike meant to end things immediately and painlessly. I was fast, faster than any human eye could track, faster than any human nervous system could process and respond to in time. She was not there when my claws arrived. I do not mean she dodged quickly. I mean she was simply gone from the space my strike passed through, and by the time my mind caught up with what had happened, she was already behind me, her hand resting lightly against my shoulder blade, in a position that could have ended the match if she had chosen to press harder. She did not press harder. She stepped back instead, giving me room, giving me a chance to reset. I turned, confused, my confidence shaken but not yet broken. I told myself it was a fluke, the same word I had used after her first demonstration days earlier. I attacked again, faster this time, driving forward with both hands, forcing her toward the edge of the mat, where I assumed her options would run out. She used my own momentum against me, redirecting my weight with a small motion of her arm, and I found myself stumbling past her, catching myself just before I struck the padded wall. The room, which had been filled with quiet murmurs from my crew moments before, had gone completely silent. I looked toward Commander Vale, expecting to see him rolling his eyes at my clumsiness, ready to dismiss the moment as an aberration. Instead, his expression had changed. He was watching Elena now, not me. His eyes narrowed with something I had never seen on his face before. It looked almost like concern. I refused to accept what was happening. I told myself that speed alone was not enough, that if I simply overwhelmed her with continuous pressure, she would eventually make a mistake, and then the match would end the way it was always meant to end. I abandoned caution and attacked without pause, strike after strike, each one faster than the last, each one missing by margins so small I could feel the air displaced by her movements. She never struck back, not once. She simply moved, reading each attack before I fully committed to it, positioning herself just outside the range of my claws, conserving her energy while I burned through mine. I did not understand it at the time, but she was studying me, learning the rhythm of my movements, the same way I imagined a hunter studies prey before choosing the moment to act. After nearly 2 minutes of continuous attacks, my breathing had grown ragged, sweat beginning to form along my scaled skin, despite the climate-controlled chamber. 2 minutes should have meant nothing to a Kalevorn warrior. My people could fight for hours without exhaustion. Yet here I was, already tiring, already frustrated, already beginning to understand that something about this fight did not match anything in my experience. Elena finally spoke, her voice calm despite the pace of the match, barely raised above a normal conversational tone. "You're fighting like someone who has never faced an opponent who studies him back," she said. I did not respond. I did not have the breath to spare for a response. I attacked again instead, driven now by something closer to desperation than confidence, though I refused to name it that way in my own mind. This time she did not simply avoid my strike. She caught my wrist mid-motion, used the momentum of my own attack to pull me forward, and redirected my balance so completely that I found myself on the mat before I understood how I had gotten there. The impact was not violent. She had controlled it carefully, cushioning my fall enough to avoid injury, which somehow made the moment worse. She had not simply defeated me. She had chosen exactly how much force to use, calculating the outcome with a precision that left no room for accident or luck. I pushed myself up quickly, embarrassment burning hotter than any physical pain, and reached for the case at her feet without thinking, some primal instinct telling me the true test had not yet begun. "Draw it," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "Stop holding back." She studied me for a long moment before answering, and in that pause I saw something shift in her expression, something that was not triumph and was not pity, but a kind of quiet recognition, as if she had been waiting for exactly this reaction from me the entire time. "You're sure?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as something closer to a warning. I told her I was certain, my pride refusing to allow any other answer, even as some distant part of my mind whispered that I should stop, that I had already learned enough, that continuing down this path would cost me something I could not yet name. She knelt down, unclipped the case, and lifted it with both hands. The metal caught the light of the chamber, plain and unadorned, without the ceremonial engravings I might have expected from a weapon carried with such apparent significance. She opened it slowly, revealing a blade inside, long and slender, its edge catching the light in a way that made the entire room fall silent once more. I expected an ornamental sword, a relic without practical purpose, the kind of thing displayed in museums rather than carried into combat. What I saw instead was something clearly maintained with care, its surface free of rust or wear, despite what must have been considerable age, its balance evident even from where I stood, watching her lift it from its resting place. She held it for a moment without moving, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and steady. I noticed the other humans in the room had gone still as well, their earlier calm replaced by something more focused, more attentive, as if they understood what was about to happen in a way I still did not. When she opened her eyes again, something in them had changed. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said quietly, still holding the blade loosely at her side. "She carried it through a war that nearly ended everything she cared about. She passed it to my mother, who carried it through a different war. One fought with different weapons but the same cost. My mother passed it to me before she died, and she told me something I did not understand until years later. I did not interrupt her. Something in her voice held the entire room in place, my crew included, none of us speaking, none of us moving. She told me that a blade like this is not carried because it is the best weapon available, Elena continued. It is carried because it remembers something that easier weapons let you forget. It reminds you that every fight costs something, that every victory has weight, that you cannot simply press a button from a safe distance and walk away unchanged. It keeps you honest about what you're doing and why you're doing it. I felt something shift inside me as she spoke, though I could not yet identify what it was. I told myself it was nothing, simply words meant to unsettle me, before the true demonstration began, a psychological tactic rather than genuine meaning. I clung to that explanation, because the alternative frightened me more than I was ready to admit. She raised the blade then, settling into a new stance, one entirely different from her earlier unarmed posture. This one carried weight, history, purpose. Every line of her body seemed to align with the weapon in her hand, as if the two had become a single instrument rather than a person holding an object. I attacked first, unwilling to give her the advantage of initiative, my claws extended toward her exposed side in a strike I had used to end countless training matches before. She moved to meet me. What happened next unfolded faster than my mind could properly process in the moment, though I have replayed it countless times since, trying to understand exactly how she achieved what she achieved. She did not retreat. She did not circle away from my attack the way she had during the unarmed portion of our match. She stepped directly into the strike, her blade rising in a motion so precise it seemed almost gentle, redirecting my claws away from her body with barely any visible effort. The tip of her blade came to rest against the side of my neck before I even understood the exchange had happened. She did not press it forward, she simply held it there, perfectly still, her eyes locked on mine, waiting to see what I would do next. I froze completely, every instinct in my body screaming at me not to move, not because of any physical threat I could clearly identify, but because of something deeper, some primal recognition that I had encountered something far beyond my understanding of strength. The referee called the match, declaring Elena the winner, though the words barely registered through the ringing in my ears. She lowered the blade slowly, stepping back, giving me space to recover whatever remained of my composure. The chamber remained silent for several long seconds afterward, no one quite willing to break whatever spell had settled over the room. I looked at my crew, expecting outrage, expecting demands for a rematch, expecting anything other than what I actually saw. Commander Vale was staring at Elena, with an expression I had never witnessed on a Kael'Vorn officer before, something caught between disbelief and reluctant respect. The rest of my crew mirrored his expression, none of them speaking, none of them meeting my eyes. I turned back to Elena, opening my mouth to say something, though I had no idea what words could possibly follow what had just happened. She spoke before I found any. "That wasn't luck," she said quietly, echoing the word I had used so many times over the past several days. "And it wasn't a fluke either. It was something you don't have a word for yet in your language, but you're about to learn it." I did not understand what she meant by that, not fully, not in that moment. I would understand it soon enough, though not in the way I expected, and not without cost to the pride I had carried into that chamber like armor I did not know how fragile it truly was. News of the match spread through the ship faster than any official report could have carried it. By the time I returned to my quarters, message requests had already begun arriving from other vessels in the fleet. Officers who had heard fragments of what happened and wanted confirmation, wanted details, wanted to know if the stories were exaggerated the way stories often are, when they travel through several mouths before reaching their final audience. I did not answer any of them that first night. I sat alone in my quarters, staring at the wall, replaying the match over and over in my mind, searching for the moment where I could have done something differently, some adjustment that would have changed the outcome. I found nothing. Every version of the fight I imagined ended the same way, with cold metal resting against my neck, and a silence in the room that told me everyone present understood something fundamental had shifted. Commander Vale requested my presence the following morning, and I arrived expecting reprimand, expecting anger at the embarrassment I had brought upon the fleet. Instead, I found him sitting quietly, staring at a data screen displaying historical records he had apparently spent the entire night pulling from the Concord archive. "Do you know what she used?" he asked without looking up. I told him I did not, that the weapon itself seemed almost primitive compared to anything modern militaries used, a curiosity rather than a genuine tool of war. He turned the screen toward me, revealing pages of information about human military history, records I had never bothered to study, because I had never considered them relevant. Humans, it turned out, had been forging bladed weapons for thousands of years, before ever developing energy-based technology. Entire lineages of craftsmanship had been passed down across generations, techniques refined over centuries, weapons treated not as tools but as extensions of the people who carried them. I asked him why any of this mattered, why a species would cling to something so outdated once superior alternatives became available. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled up another file, this one containing footage from human historical archives, recordings of past conflicts, stretching back further than I had realized humanity's recorded history extended. I watched images of soldiers fighting in conditions that should have broken any reasonable species, enduring hardships that would have caused my own people to retreat and regroup, choosing instead to continue forward despite overwhelming disadvantage. "They don't fight because they enjoy it," Vale said quietly. "They fight because somewhere along the way, they learned that giving up costs more than continuing does, and they never forgot that lesson, even after they stopped needing to fight for survival every single day." I did not want to hear this. I told him it proved nothing, that ancient history had no bearing on modern capability, that a single soldier's skill with an outdated weapon did not represent an entire species' military strength. He looked at me then with an expression that silenced whatever else I intended to say. "That soldier disarmed you without injury, in front of both crews, using a weapon her ancestors carried before either of our species had left our home planets," he said. "She did not do that because she is unusually gifted. She did that because her species has spent its entire existence learning how to survive against opponents stronger than themselves, and they never stopped training for it, even after the wars that shaped that training ended." I left his office with more questions than answers, unable to shake the feeling that I had fundamentally misunderstood something about the species I had mocked so freely since my arrival. I decided, against my better judgment, to seek out Elena directly, to ask her the questions I could not bring myself to ask my own commander. I found her in the observation deck later that day, alone, staring out at the stars with the same quiet patience she always carried. She did not seem surprised to see me approach, though she did not turn immediately either, giving me a moment to gather whatever words I intended to say. I told her, somewhat awkwardly, that I wanted to understand what I had witnessed during our match, that the explanations I had received so far felt incomplete, that something about her fighting style suggested knowledge deeper than simple training could provide. She turned to face me then, studying my expression for a long moment before answering. "You want to know why we still carry blades," she said. "Why we still teach hand-to-hand combat when we have weapons that could end a fight from 1,000 kilometers away." I told her that was exactly what I wanted to know. She gestured toward the seat beside her, and I hesitated only briefly before accepting the invitation, settling into the chair with a wariness I had not expected to feel in the presence of someone half my size. "Humans fought each other for most of our history," she began. "Not against other species, not against anything from beyond our own world. We fought ourselves, for reasons that seemed important at the time, and now mostly look foolish in hindsight. Territory, resources, ideas about who deserved power and who did not. We came very close to destroying ourselves more than once, long before any of you ever noticed we existed." I asked her how that history explained her skill with a blade specifically, rather than any of the countless other weapons humanity had developed over the centuries. "Because blades teach you something guns and energy weapons never can," she said. "When you fight with a blade, you cannot pretend distance protects you from the consequences of what you're doing. You feel every moment of it. You understand exactly what you're risking, and exactly what you're taking from your opponent. That kind of understanding shapes how you think about conflict long after the fighting stops." I sat with that explanation for a long moment, turning it over in my mind, trying to reconcile it with everything I had previously believed about strength and weakness. "My people believe strength comes from biology," I finally said. "From claws, from venom, from bodies built for combat before birth. We do not need to be taught these things. They are simply part of what we are. She nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. That's exactly the difference, she said. Your strength was given to you. Ours had to be built, generation after generation, through choices rather than biology. And things you build yourself, you understand in a way you can never understand something you were simply born with. You know exactly how much it costs, because you paid that cost personally, over and over, until it became part of who you are. I did not respond immediately, unable to find a counter-argument that felt honest, rather than defensive. She continued speaking, her voice remaining calm and measured throughout, though something in her tone suggested she was choosing her words carefully, deciding how much to reveal to someone who had spent the past several days mocking everything her species represented. When my grandmother carried that blade, she was not fighting for glory, or for pride, or to prove anything to anyone watching, Elena said. She was fighting because the alternative was watching everyone she cared about disappear. That kind of motivation does not fade after one generation. It gets passed down, refined, taught to children who then teach it to their own children, until an entire species understands something in its bones that biology alone could never provide. I asked her, somewhat hesitantly, what exactly that understanding was. She looked at me directly then, her expression unreadable in the way it had been since our very first meeting, though something behind her eyes had shifted, becoming clearer, more direct. That losing is not the same as dying, she said. That you can be defeated again and still choose to stand back up, and that choice matters more than any single victory or loss ever could. Your species has never had to learn that lesson, because your biology has always given you the advantage. Ours had to learn it the hard way, through failure after failure, until we finally understood that persistence itself is a kind of strength that cannot be replicated through claws or venom or natural armor. I sat in silence after she finished speaking, staring out at the same stars she had been watching before I arrived, trying to process everything I had just heard. Something about her words settled into my mind differently than anything else I had encountered since arriving on this assignment, challenging assumptions I had carried my entire life without ever questioning them. I asked her, finally, why she had chosen to disarm me rather than end the match more decisively, given that she clearly could have. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because winning was never the point, she said. I wanted you to understand something, not to humiliate you in front of your crew. There's a difference between defeating someone and teaching them something, and I think you needed to be taught rather than simply beaten. I felt something uncomfortable stir within me at those words, a recognition that she had shown me a kindness I had not shown her, despite everything I had said and done since our first meeting. I did not know how to respond to that recognition, so I said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch between us until it no longer felt uncomfortable. Over the following days, I found myself observing the human soldiers more closely than I had before, noticing details I had previously dismissed as irrelevant. I watched Daniel Ashford training alone in the early morning hours, running through combat forms with a precision that suggested years of disciplined practice. I watched Grace Whitfield studying tactical reports late into the night, cross-referencing historical battles with current mission parameters, searching for patterns that might prove useful in future operations. I began to understand that what I had witnessed during my match with Elena was not an isolated exception, but a reflection of something woven throughout the entire human detachment. A discipline built not from biological advantage, but from generations of hard-won understanding about what it took to survive against overwhelming odds. Commander Vale called another meeting several days later, this time including representatives from the human detachment, as well as several other Concord observers who had traveled to our vessel, specifically to review the footage from the match. I sat quietly through most of the discussion, listening as officers debated the implications of what had happened, some arguing that it represented an isolated incident, others insisting it demonstrated capabilities the Concord had significantly underestimated. Elena said little during the meeting, though when she did speak, the room fell silent to listen. She explained, patiently and without any hint of pride, the training methods humanity had developed over generations, methods that combined physical discipline with psychological resilience in ways that our own combat doctrine had never considered necessary. She spoke about persistence, about adaptability, about the willingness to continue fighting long after biological advantages would have caused another species to retreat. I watched Commander Vale's expression shift throughout her explanation, moving from skepticism to something closer to genuine interest, and I recognized in his face the same transformation I had experienced during our private conversation on the observation deck. Toward the end of the meeting, one of the visiting Concord officers asked Elena a question that lingered in my mind long after the meeting concluded. If your species is capable of what we witnessed in that match, why have you never used this capability to seek greater influence within the Concord? Why remain a provisional member rather than demanding recognition as a founding species? Elena's answer was simple, delivered without hesitation. Because strength was never meant to be used for domination, she said. It was meant to protect the people and ideas worth protecting. We learned that lesson through failure, through nearly destroying ourselves before we understood it. We have no intention of forgetting it now, no matter how the Concord chooses to categorize us. Her words settled over the room like a weight, and I found myself, for the first time since arriving on this assignment, genuinely reconsidering everything I had believed about my own species' place in the galaxy. I had always assumed strength meant biological superiority, the ability to overpower an opponent through raw physical capability. I was beginning to understand that strength could mean something entirely different, something built through choice and discipline rather than inherited through birth. That understanding did not come easily, and it did not come without resistance from parts of myself that clung to old certainties. But it came, slowly, over the following days, as I watched the human detachment continue their duties, with the same quiet discipline I had witnessed from the very beginning, never once seeking recognition or praise for what they had demonstrated, simply continuing their work as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. I began to realize that this, more than anything else, was the truest demonstration of their capability. Not the match itself, not the blade, not the precision of Elena's movements, but the complete absence of arrogance in its aftermath. They had proven something profound about themselves, and then simply returned to their duties without seeking further validation, as if the proof itself had never been necessary in the first place, as if they had always known what they were capable of, and needed no external confirmation to continue believing it. 3 weeks after the match, an emergency signal reached our vessel from a distant outpost near the edge of Concord territory, a research station that had gone silent without warning. Commander Vale assembled a response team immediately, and to my surprise, he requested that both Kael'Vorn and human forces deploy together, insisting that recent developments had convinced him a combined unit would prove more effective than either species operating alone. I found myself assigned to the same team as Elena, Ashford, and Whitfield, along with 3 of my own crew members who had witnessed the match and, like me, had spent the following weeks reconsidering assumptions they had carried their entire lives. Captain Locke coordinated the overall operation from our transport vessel, directing both teams with the same calm precision I had come to expect from him during our brief time working alongside his detachment. We arrived at the research station to find it eerily quiet, its exterior lighting flickering weakly against the darkness of space, no response coming from any of our attempted communications. Commander Vale ordered a cautious approach, splitting our combined team into 2 groups to search the facility from opposite entry points, gathering information before committing to any single course of action. I found myself paired with Elena for the search, an arrangement that felt strange given everything that had happened between us, though neither of us mentioned the match as we moved through the darkened corridors of the station. She moved with the same quiet confidence I remembered from our first encounter, scanning each room methodically, her attention never wavering despite the unsettling silence surrounding us. We discovered the source of the station's silence roughly 20 minutes into our search, finding several research personnel unconscious in the main laboratory, their vital signs weak but stable, no obvious injuries explaining their condition. Elena knelt beside the nearest researcher, checking his pulse with practiced efficiency, while I scanned the room for any indication of what had caused this situation. The environmental systems have been tampered with, she said quietly, gesturing toward a control panel that had clearly been forced open, its wiring exposed and rearranged in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than accidental malfunction. I asked her what she believed had happened, and she considered the question carefully before answering, her eyes scanning the room for additional evidence. Someone wanted these researchers unconscious rather than dead, she said, which means whoever did this needed something from this station badly enough to avoid drawing attention through more obvious means. We continued our search, moving deeper into the facility, eventually discovering a maintenance corridor leading toward a restricted section of the station that our initial briefing had not mentioned. Elena paused at the entrance, studying the door mechanism with the same careful attention she had given the environmental controls. "This has been recently accessed," she said, "within the past few hours, based on the wear patterns around the lock mechanism." I contacted Commander Vale to report our findings, and he instructed us to proceed cautiously, promising to send additional support while continuing his own team's search through the remaining sections of the facility. Elena and I moved through the restricted door together, finding ourselves in a narrow passage that descended toward what appeared to be a secondary research laboratory, one significantly smaller than the main facility we had already explored. The room beyond contained equipment I did not recognize, technology that seemed to combine elements of Concord design with something distinctly unfamiliar, suggesting either experimental research or something far more concerning. Elena moved closer to examine the equipment, her expression growing increasingly focused as she studied the readouts displayed across several monitors positioned throughout the room. "This isn't standard Concord technology," she said quietly. "Someone has been running experiments here that fall well outside normal research protocols." Before either of us could investigate further, movement near the far end of the room caught my attention. A figure emerging from behind a bank of equipment, weapon raised and pointed directly at us. I recognized the species immediately, a Draconi mercenary, part of a group known throughout Concord space for accepting contracts from parties willing to operate outside established regulations. The mercenary spoke quickly, demanding we lower our weapons and step away from the equipment, his voice carrying the particular tension of someone who had not expected to encounter resistance during whatever operation he had been sent to complete. Elena did not immediately comply, though she also did not raise her own weapon, her hands remaining visible and non-threatening as she addressed him directly. "You don't need to do this," she said calmly. "Whatever they're paying you, it isn't worth what happens if this goes wrong." The mercenary's weapon wavered slightly, though his aim remained steady enough to concern me. I remained still, uncertain how to proceed, aware that any sudden movement on my part could escalate the situation beyond what either of us could control. "I have a job to finish," he said, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like desperation rather than genuine confidence. "I can't walk away from this now." Elena took a small step forward, her posture remaining non-threatening despite the movement, her voice softening slightly as she continued speaking. "Then let us help you finish it in a way that doesn't end with someone getting hurt," she said. "Whoever hired you clearly didn't tell you everything about what you were walking into. That research station personnel are unconscious, not dead, which means someone wanted this handled quietly. That's not the kind of job that ends well for the person actually doing the dirty work." I watched the mercenary's expression shift as her words settled over him, uncertainty replacing the desperate confidence he had carried moments before. He glanced toward the equipment behind him, then back toward Elena, his weapon lowering fractionally as he seemed to genuinely consider what she had said. Before he could respond further, additional movement erupted from a side passage I had not previously noticed. Two more mercenaries emerging with weapons already raised, clearly alerted by the sound of our conversation. The situation shifted immediately, tension flooding the room as all three mercenaries repositioned themselves, their earlier hesitation replaced by renewed aggression now that they had numerical advantage. I moved instinctively to protect Elena, positioning myself between her and the nearest threat, my claws extending, despite knowing they would offer little protection against modern weaponry. She did not retreat behind me the way I expected. Instead, she moved alongside me, matching my positioning with practiced coordination, her own hand reaching toward the case still strapped across her back. The confrontation that followed happened faster than I could fully process in the moment, though I have replayed it countless times since, trying to understand exactly how Elena managed to defuse a situation that seemed destined to end badly for everyone involved. She spoke calmly throughout, her voice never rising despite the weapons pointed toward us, addressing each mercenary individually, appealing to whatever hesitation remained beneath their aggressive posturing. She did not draw her blade. Not immediately. She kept her hands visible, her posture non-threatening, buying time while continuing to speak, dismantling their confidence piece by piece, through calm reasoning, rather than aggressive confrontation. I watched her work in a way I had not fully appreciated during our earlier match, understanding now that her skill extended far beyond physical combat into something more subtle, more patient, more genuinely effective in situations where violence remained avoidable. The original mercenary, the one who had first confronted us, finally lowered his weapon completely, some internal calculation shifting in his favor as Elena's words continued to resonate. He said something quietly to his companions, and after a tense moment of hesitation, they lowered their weapons as well, though their expressions remained wary, uncertain what would happen next. Commander Vale arrived moments later with additional support, and the situation resolved without further incident, the mercenaries surrendering peacefully once they understood the scope of what they had actually been hired to accomplish. It became clear, through subsequent investigation, that they had been misled about the nature of their assignment, believing they were retrieving stolen research materials rather than participating in something considerably more dangerous, involving experimental technology, with implications reaching far beyond a single research station. Later that evening, aboard our transport vessel, I found myself sitting across from Elena in the ship's small mess hall, both of us processing the events of the day in relative silence. I studied her for a long moment before finally speaking, unable to shake the questions that had been building within me since our confrontation with the mercenaries. "You could have simply drawn your blade the moment they threatened us," I said. "It would have ended things faster, with less risk." She considered my words carefully before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Faster isn't always better," she said. "Those mercenaries weren't soldiers who understood exactly what they were risking. They were people who had been misled into a dangerous situation, and drawing a weapon immediately would have confirmed whatever fear or aggression they were already feeling. Sometimes, the most effective strength is the strength to wait, to talk, to give someone a chance to choose differently before forcing a confrontation that might not have been necessary at all." I sat with her words for a long moment, recognizing in them the same lesson she had tried to teach me during our earlier conversation on the observation deck, though applied now to a situation far removed from formal combat training. I asked her, finally, what she had felt in that moment, facing 3 armed opponents with nothing but calm words, and a blade she had chosen not to draw. She was quiet for a while before answering, her eyes distant, as though searching for the right words to describe something difficult to fully articulate. "Fear," she said simply. "Real fear, the kind that makes your hands shake if you let it. But fear isn't the same as weakness. My grandmother taught me that a long time ago. She said the difference between courage and recklessness is that courage feels the fear completely and chooses to act anyway, while recklessness simply doesn't understand what it's risking in the first place." I thought about my own experience during our match weeks earlier, the moment her blade had rested against my neck, the fear I had felt in that instant, a fear unlike anything I had experienced before despite my species' long history of combat. I finally understood, sitting there in that quiet mess hall, that the fear I had felt was not a sign of weakness on my part, but a recognition of something genuinely formidable, something built through generations of hard-won understanding, rather than simple biological advantage. I asked her one final question before we parted ways that evening, one that had been forming in my mind since our very first meeting. "Why did you never respond to my insults, all those weeks ago?" she said. "Why did you simply smile, instead of defending yourself?" She smiled again now, the same tired, patient expression I remembered from our earliest encounters. "Because I already knew something you didn't yet understand," she said. "I knew that words don't need defending when actions eventually speak for themselves. I could have argued with you for hours and changed nothing. But I could show you something instead, and once you saw it clearly, no argument would have been necessary at all." I left that conversation with a clarity I had not possessed before arriving on this assignment, a fundamental shift in how I understood strength, weakness, and the true nature of the species I had once dismissed so carelessly. I did not yet know how significantly that shift would influence the months that followed, or how deeply it would reshape my understanding of what it truly meant to be a warrior in a galaxy far more complicated than I had ever allowed myself to consider. 6 months passed before I saw Elena Voss again, months during which I had returned to fleet duty, carrying with me a perspective I could not fully explain to my own crew, without sounding as though I had somehow betrayed the pride of my species. I did not believe that, not anymore, though convincing others of that truth proved considerably more difficult than accepting it myself had been. My official report following the events at the research station had caused considerable stir among Concord leadership, particularly the sections detailing human combat capability and the philosophy underlying their approach to conflict. I had written it honestly, without exaggeration, describing exactly what I had witnessed and experienced, without softening any of it to protect my own pride. Commander Vale had reviewed the report before submission, adding his own observations to reinforce mine, and together, we had presented a picture of humanity considerably different from the dismissive assumptions that had characterized Concord attitudes toward the species since their provisional membership began. The response had been mixed, as I expected. Some officers dismissed our observations as isolated incidents, insisting that a single soldier's exceptional skill did not represent broader human capability. Others, particularly those who had reviewed the footage from the match or read detailed accounts of the confrontation at the research station, began advocating for reconsidering humanity's standing within the Concord entirely, suggesting that their contributions deserved greater recognition than their current provisional status allowed. I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, becoming an advocate for that reconsideration, speaking at several fleet briefings about what I had witnessed, describing not just Elena's combat skill, but the broader philosophy that seemed to underpin human military doctrine, a philosophy built around persistence, adaptability, and a genuine understanding of what conflict actually cost, rather than simple biological dominance. The situation that finally brought Elena back into my life arrived without warning, a distress signal from a joint Concord outpost near contested territory, indicating an incursion from a hostile faction that had been probing Concord borders for months without triggering full-scale conflict. Command decided a rapid response team, combining multiple species' strengths, offered the best chance of resolving the situation before it escalated further. I volunteered immediately when I learned Elena's unit had also been assigned to the response team, curious to see her again, curious to understand whether the lessons I had learned during our previous encounter would hold true in a genuine combat situation, rather than a training exercise or tense standoff with mercenaries who ultimately chose not to fight. We arrived at the outpost to find the situation considerably worse than initial reports had indicated, the hostile faction having already breached outer defenses, engaging Concord forces in running skirmishes throughout the facility's lower levels. Commander Vale coordinated our combined response from the command center, directing Kaelvorn and human forces to work together in clearing the facility section by section, pushing back the incursion before it could reach the outpost's critical systems. I found myself paired with Elena once again, this time in a genuine combat scenario rather than a training exercise, moving through corridors filled with the sounds of ongoing conflict, energy weapons discharging somewhere ahead of us, shouts and warnings echoing through the facility's ventilation systems. She moved with the same calm precision I remembered, though something in her demeanor had shifted, becoming more focused, more attuned to the genuine danger surrounding us. I understood, watching her work, that everything I had witnessed during our training match had been a controlled demonstration, compared to what I now saw, her true capability emerging, fully only when the stakes became real. We encountered the hostile faction's forward elements near the facility's central junction, a small group attempting to secure a critical pathway toward the outpost's power distribution systems. Elena assessed the situation instantly, identifying the strategic importance of the position and communicating a plan to our combined team with the same calm efficiency she brought to every situation I had witnessed her navigate. The confrontation that followed tested everything I had learned about human capability during the previous months, watching Elena and her fellow soldiers work alongside my own crew, with a coordination that suggested genuine mutual respect, rather than simple tactical necessity. I found myself fighting alongside her rather than watching from a distance, understanding for the first time what it meant to trust a human soldier's judgment in the middle of an active engagement. At one critical moment, as our combined team pushed toward securing the junction, I found myself separated from the main group, cut off by a collapsed section of corridor that forced me into a narrow side passage alone. I heard sounds of continued conflict ahead, but my path forward remained blocked, leaving me isolated from the rest of our team at precisely the moment reinforcement mattered most. I made my way through an alternate route, eventually emerging into a small chamber where I discovered two hostile soldiers preparing to flank our main team from an unexpected angle, a maneuver that would have significantly complicated our efforts to secure the junction. I engaged them immediately, relying on my own combat training to neutralize the threat before they could execute their plan. though the exchange left me injured, my earlier confidence in my own capability, tempered by the genuine difficulty of the fight. I managed to disable both opponents, though not without cost, a deep wound along my side slowing my movements considerably as I attempted to rejoin the main team. I heard footsteps approaching from the corridor behind me, and turned, expecting additional hostile forces, only to find Elena instead, having apparently noticed my absence, and backtracked to find me. She assessed my condition quickly, applying emergency treatment to slow the bleeding while maintaining awareness of our surroundings, never losing focus on potential threats, despite the immediate concern of my injury. "You should have called for support instead of engaging alone," she said, her tone carrying concern rather than criticism. I told her I had not wanted to divert resources from the main engagement, that I believed I could handle 2 opponents without assistance. She finished treating my wound before responding, her expression serious, despite the calm efficiency of her movements. "That's not strength," she said. "That's the same mistake I tried to teach you to avoid during our match. Real strength includes knowing when you need support, not just proving you can handle everything alone." Her words settled over me with familiar weight, echoing lessons I thought I had already absorbed but apparently still needed reinforcement to fully internalize. I nodded, acknowledging the point, grateful for her presence despite the discomfort of admitting I had made an error in judgment. We made our way back toward the main engagement together, my movements slower than usual due to my injury, though Elena remained close throughout, providing support without making the assistance feel like pity or condescension. We arrived to find the main team had successfully secured the junction, the hostile faction retreating, after realizing their flanking maneuver had failed, their overall position no longer viable, given the combined resistance they now faced. The engagement concluded within the hour, Concord forces successfully repelling the incursion and securing the outpost against further immediate threat. Commander Vale commended the combined team's performance during the debrief that followed, specifically noting the effectiveness of coordinated tactics between Kael'vorn and human forces, a combination that had proven considerably more capable than either species operating independently. I sat with Elena afterward, my injury treated properly by the outpost's medical staff, both of us processing the events of the engagement in the relative quiet of the facility's recovery area. I studied her for a long moment before finally speaking, aware that this conversation might be the last opportunity I had to fully articulate everything I had come to understand since our first meeting months earlier. "I owe you an apology," I said, "for everything I said when we first met. I was wrong about your species, wrong about what strength actually means, wrong about nearly everything I believed before I met you." She considered my words carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant, no trace of satisfaction at having proven me wrong so thoroughly. "You don't owe me an apology," she said. "You owe yourself one, for believing something false for so long that it nearly cost you the chance to understand something true. I'm not interested in being right. I'm interested in whether you actually learned something that matters." I told her I had, that the lessons from our first encounter had followed me through every experience since, shaping how I approached not just combat, but every interaction with species different from my own. She smiled then, the same expression I remembered from our earliest meetings, though something in it now carried genuine warmth rather than tired patience. "Then it was worth it," she said. "All of it. The match, the argument, everything that happened between us since. If you actually learned something real, then none of it was wasted." I asked her, finally, about the blade she still carried, the one that had originally caught my attention when we first met, wondering if she intended to pass it down someday, the way her mother and grandmother had passed it to her. She glanced down at the case resting beside her, her expression growing thoughtful as she considered the question. "Someday," she said, "when I find someone who understands what it actually represents, not just as a weapon, but as a reminder of everything it took for us to become who we are. Someone who understands that real strength isn't about biology or technology, but about choosing to keep going, even when everything tells you to stop." I thought about my own species then, about the 10,000 years of conflict that had shaped us, about the pride I had carried into our first meeting, and the humility I now carried in its place. I understood, sitting there in that quiet recovery room, that Elena had taught me something my own history had never fully taught me despite our long tradition of combat. Something about the difference between strength given by biology and strength earned through choice and sacrifice. Months later, back aboard my own vessel, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since my first dismissive encounter with humanity's provisional membership in the Concord. I no longer laughed at the thought of human soldiers standing alongside my own kind. I no longer considered their weapons primitive or their combat philosophy naive. I had learned, through direct experience rather than second-hand reports, that strength took many forms, and that the forms built through generations of hard-won understanding often proved more resilient than anything biology alone could provide. I maintained contact with Elena over the following months, our conversations gradually shifting from formal military correspondence to something closer to genuine friendship, built on mutual respect, earned through shared experience rather than simple diplomatic necessity. She told me, during one such conversation, that Commander Vale had recommended expanding joint training exercises between our species, a proposal that had gained significant traction following the reports from both the research station incident and the recent engagement at the contested outpost. I found myself looking forward to that expanded cooperation, curious to see how much more I might learn from continued exposure to human military philosophy, curious whether other Kael'Vorn officers might undergo the same transformation I had experienced, moving from dismissive contempt to genuine respect through direct experience rather than abstract argument. I still remember, vividly, the moment her blade first rested against my neck during that initial match, the fear I felt in that instant, unlike anything I had experienced in my long career as a Kael'Vorn warrior. I understand now that the fear I felt was not weakness, but recognition, an instinctive understanding that I had encountered something built through generations of sacrifice and discipline, something that could not be dismissed or underestimated, regardless of biological differences between our species. I understand now what fear truly means, not as an enemy to be avoided, but as a signal worth listening to, a recognition that something genuinely formidable stands before you, deserving of respect rather than ridicule. Elena Voss taught me that lesson, not through anger or aggression, but through patient demonstration and honest conversation, allowing me to reach understanding through my own experience, rather than simply accepting her words on faith. I no longer ridicule Earth's warriors. I have stood across from one, felt her blade against my skin, and understood in that instant everything my pride had prevented me from seeing before. I carry that understanding with me now, into every future encounter with humanity, grateful for the lesson, even as I remain humbled by how thoroughly it was taught. The galaxy is vast, filled with countless species, each carrying their own understanding of strength, courage, and what it truly means to fight for something worth protecting. I once believed my own species' biological advantages made us superior to all others, a belief I carried with pride for the entirety of my career. I know now that such pride blinded me to something far more important, a truth that Elena Voss showed me not through argument, but through the simple act of drawing her blade and standing her ground, teaching me in a single moment what years of study never could have revealed on their own. I understand now what fear means, and I am grateful, more than I ever expected to be, that I learned that lesson from someone who never needed to raise her voice to teach it.